Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Meeting Minds session. I'm Rebecca Baxter, and I'm Development Director at Kellogg College. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'd be really grateful if you could keep your microphones muted during the talk, just to avoid any background noise. There will be a chance to answer questions during the session. And to do that, you can either raise a digital hand or put any questions in the chat box, which is being covered by my colleague Shabazz and me. And finally, we are recording today's session. So please feel free to leave your video on if you like. You'll only actually be visible if you decide to speak. So housekeeping out the way, I'm now really delighted to welcome our speaker, Caitlin Lambert. Caitlin is Executive Director at the Children's Legal Defence Centre in Somaliland and an alumna of Kellogg, having studied for her Masters in International Human Rights Law. Caitlin has been working as a human rights lawyer in Somaliland since 2015. And the Children's Legal Defence Centre is a non-profit organisation in Somaliland that defends wrongfully and unjustly imprisoned children. So to find out more, I'm now going to hand you over to Caitlin. Caitlin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the kind introduction. And I also want to thank the whole Kellogg Alumni Relations team for inviting me to speak today and putting this talk together and making it happen. I grew up in a small rural area in the United States, and I never thought I would actually study at Oxford, much less being invited to speak at an alumni event. So I'm really excited to be here today. And one thing we were discussing when we were doing the housekeeping before you all joined us is that my internet is a little shaky. So I'm just going to say a hello so you can see my face via video. But now I'm going to turn my video off so that hopefully that helps stabilize my connection. So I'm just going to turn it off now. Great. So hopefully you can all still hear me. And when I was preparing for this talk, I was really struggling with how to begin the story of my work in the Horn of Africa and what made me crazy enough to co-found a legal defense center for imprisoned children in the middle of a global pandemic. I was really struggling with how do I make this relatable? How do I center this sometimes long and meandering story about my work here in Somaliland? And after thinking about it for a bit, I realized the answer is simple, that I should start with what we all have in common. Oxford. So I came to Oxford, as I imagine many of you did, because of what I wanted to become. And what I wanted to become was a human rights lawyer, right? A lawyer that, used the law to advance justice, to challenge the status quo, and really at the end of the day, make a positive difference in people's lives. And my time at Oxford and at Kellogg undoubtedly helped me on this journey. I was surrounded by professors and classmates who challenged me, inspired me, and really emboldened me. But it wasn't where I became a human rights lawyer. I would say I became a human rights lawyer working inside jails and prisons in Somaliland. For those of you who aren't familiar with Somaliland, it's a self-declared state in the Horn of Africa. So technically, it's part of Somalia, but it's declared independence, meaning it doesn't have international recognition, as you can see at the top of this map here. During colonialism, it was a British protectorate, and then at independence, it joined with then Italian Somaliland to form the current state of Somalia that we're all familiar with. But in the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a really violent brutal civil war in Somalia that overturned a military dictatorship. And after this civil war is when the north of Somalia, now Somaliland, declared independence. And while Somaliland doesn't have international recognition, right? It can't get funding from the World Bank or other things that states can do. It has made great strides towards building a state based on democratic principles, right? Somaliland regularly has free and fair elections. They vote their president in. They just voted in their parliament. They have a legal framework that embodies a lot of, individual freedoms, human rights. But like most places in the world, it has people who are wrongfully imprisoned, including children. And it's through this work with wrongfully and unjustly imprisoned children in Somaliland that I think I really became a human rights lawyer. And not just simply because of what I've achieved or the type of work I've been able to do, but because of 3 specific things I've learned that have changed my whole perspective. The first lesson is jails and prisons won't get us to where we want to be. And what I mean by this is, if we want children to grow up into citizens who can contribute to Somaliland, who can contribute to the development of communities, and really not just in Somaliland, but throughout the world, then we need to rethink the reflex of imprisoning children in criminal punishment as the first response to bad behavior, right? In Somaliland, the government's first response to children who are accused of crimes is imprisonment. They're imprisoned whether or not they're guilty. They're imprisoned whether or not there's evidence against them. They're imprisoned whether or not they're even old enough for criminal punishment. You have to be 15 in Somaliland before you can be taken before the criminal courts. But despite all this, police are arresting them, prosecution is trying them, and judges often sentence children to years in prison. And when we think about it, we often say, okay, criminal justice in prison is about rehabilitation. We have to rehabilitate people so that they can rejoin society. But from what I've learned in Somaliland, really, it's not an exercise in rehabilitation, it's an exercise in punishment. When people go to prison or jail, they're in concrete group cells without education services, without access to their families, often without access to lawyers. And this is just not the right response. But funnily enough, this is my view on this issue wasn't so nuanced when I arrived in Somaliland in 2015. I really thought, at that point when I arrived, that criminal punishment, the criminal law, there was a place for prisons in advancing human rights. And I thought this way because my background was in international criminal law. I had just come from the International Criminal Court, so I was really thinking about ending impunity and thinking about, bad behavior purely from the perspective of the victim. I wasn't thinking about what is really the reality of sending an individual, especially children, to prison for years. I wasn't thinking, what does that really mean? What does that really look like? It seemed very abstract because I had never been inside a jail or a prison. But once I started working in jails and prisons, my perspective changed. And it changed because of the children that I've met there. So this is a picture of a boy called Abd Hakim. Abd Hakim is 13 years old and he lives in Hargeisa. And when we started working on his case, he's one of our clients. He had been unlawfully held in a jail cell for 51 days. For those 51 days, he was in a concrete group cell. He was held alongside adults right? Because they don't have the capacity to separate children from adults in jail and prison cells. He didn't have access to school for those 51 days, and he had very limited contact with his family. And the rub of it is, Abd Hakim was in this situation because, like many of the children who are in jails and prisons in Somaliland, he was accused of stealing a cell phone. Cell phone theft is a problem in urban areas in Somaliland. There's not a lot of recreation opportunities for children here. There's not a lot of public land. There's no parks where they can just go hang out for free. So what this ends up looking like is teenage boys like Abd Hakim, 13, 14, 15, they end up hanging out on streets together. And they want cell phones, so they end up nicking cell phones, maybe, you know, a simple Nokia, maybe something like a Samsung, from people on the street. And, you know, there's been a lot of pushback from the communities here in Somaliland asking, you know, the government to do something about this, right? And what the government has decided to do is take a tough on crime approach to these boys who are stealing cell phones. Many of the children that I've met in prison, they're serving an on average 3 years for stealing a phone. And these children are sentenced to years in prison because this offense of stealing a phone is being prosecuted as robbery, right? The prosecutor is deciding to charge not simple theft, but robbery, which is a violent crime. But the thing of it is, when you meet these teenagers in jails and prisons, you don't meet a violent criminal, you meet a child. There's a well-known criminal defense attorney in the US called Brian Stevenson. And when he's talking about his clients, he says, we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. And what I think he means by this is just because someone is accused or convicted of a crime, it doesn't mean that they should be labeled a criminal, stripped of their humanity and imprisoned for years. And this is especially true for children. But the reality on the ground, the reality in Somaliland is, as soon as a child like Abd Hakim is arrested and accused, they're labeled a criminal. And this narrative of criminality allows us to rationalize keeping them in jails and prisons for months and even years. And this challenge of the narrative of criminality, you know, we don't just see it in Somaliland, but it's in other criminal justice systems around the world, like the United States, where I come from, you know, is probably the #1 leader in keeping people in prison for years when they shouldn't be. And, you know, when I think about this, when I reflect on this, when I, you know, think deeply about why we're putting children in prison for years for things that are really amount to teenage bad behavior. Where I come out on this is really, if we want children like Abd Hakim to grow up into productive citizens that can contribute to their country, that can contribute to the development of Somaliland, right? If Somaliland is ever going to gain international recognition, which it wants within the global community, that it wants to be an independent state from Somalia, then it needs to be investing in its youth, right? It needs to be investing in the future. That's just common sense. But the common sense doesn't apply to when we're thinking about how do we deal with wrong behavior. But really, if working with children like Abd Hakim has taught me anything about justice, has taught me anything about being a human rights lawyer, it's that jails and prisons will not get us to where we want to be. So the second lesson I've learned from my work in Somaliland is justice isn't only found in human rights law or the courts. You know, when I flew into Somaliland and landed here in 2015, a very narrow idea of justice. I thought justice was what I learned in law school in the US. I thought justice is what I saw being done at the International Criminal Court. I really thought if we were going to achieve human rights, if we were going to impact the world in a positive way, that the law gave us a really powerful platform for that. And when I was thinking about the law, I was thinking very narrowly, right? Law in the Western sense. But one of the things I've learned in Somaliland is that's not just the case. So in Somaliland, the legal framework is a bit more complicated. There are 3 types of law. So there's statutory law, based largely on British colonial era law, right? The laws that we would think of in the US or the UK or other Western contexts of, this is the penal code, these are the laws on the books, right? So that's statutory based law. Somaliland also has customary law, so traditional law, and this is the oldest type of law here. Somaliland is a clan-based society, so this customary law governs behavior and disputes between the clans, right? Between families, between groups. And the 3rd type of law Somaliland has is Sharia law. So it's a Muslim majority country, and Sharia is considered the supreme law. But, when I flew into Somaliland in 2015 and started working here, my assumption and my bias was that we could only find justice in the statutory system, right? I thought both customary law and Sharia law were really antithetical to human rights, that they were, what we had to move away from. Customary law can be very discriminatory towards women, and Sharia law can have what it seemed like extreme punishments. But I didn't get this idea from anywhere strange, I don't think. This idea that customary law and Sharia law are against rights is a very common idea of justice actors, national actors that are working to reform the justice system in this part of the world. And if you just personally think about what you see in the media, right? If Africa is going to advance, then we need to move past traditional modes of law, right? If we want investment, then we need to look in statutory law, not customary law. Or, if we think about what we know about Sharia law just from the media alone, right? It's often painted as the very opposite of what we're trying to seek with human rights. But my Somaliland colleagues have showed me that this isn't the whole truth. So the man in this photo is my colleague and co-founder at the Children's Legal Defense Center. His name is Idris. He's a Somaliland lawyer. He both grew up here and he earned his law degree here. And the girl he's sitting with is one of our clients. Her name is Amina, and she's 17 years old. The child she is holding is her baby. Her newborn baby was born about a week before we took this photo together. And, Amina, at the age of 17, she found herself pregnant and unmarried in what is a very traditional society. So her prospects did not look good, right? She was not being supported by a husband. She was not being supported by her family. So she looked into other options, and the option she found to start supporting herself and her future child was selling alcohol. But alcohol in a Muslim majority country, as you can imagine, is criminalized. It's a crime to both drink alcohol or sell alcohol in any form. And she was convicted for trading alcohol. She was convicted while she was pregnant. and she had to have her baby while she was imprisoned. When we got Amina's case, she had just been sentenced to 3 years in prison, and she was serving the sentence. She tried herself to appeal without a lawyer. And she got her case all the way to Somaliland Supreme Court by herself. And that's when we took the case. And really the injustice in this case is there is a law on the book that mandates that convicted women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, that their prison sentence must be postponed, right? It must be postponed until the child is independent, because we don't want to punish the child who is innocent. But the thing is, the lower courts, right, the first instance court and then the appeal court, luckily, we were able to convince the court to accept this law, to accept this statutory protection of pregnant and breastfeeding women. So the photo you're seeing here is the day after Amina was released from prison. She came to visit us at our office. And in this case was a big victory for us, right? We were able to release, a 17-year-old girl and also her baby and reunite them with Amina's mother, who then had agreed to help take care of her daughter and her grandchild. So it was a happy ending in this case, but that's not always the outcome. We see this fact pattern quite frequently of pregnant or breastfeeding mothers who are convicted and sentenced. And we are currently working on an appeal of another young mother with a baby. They've been separated so the mother can serve her prison sentence. The young mother is in prison and the baby was sent to the orphanage. So this is an example of when the laws on the books, the laws in the statutory system aren't strong enough. They aren't providing this mother and baby with the protection that they need. So in this case, this appeal case, we're using Sharia. There's a Sharia principle that gives mothers the right to breastfeed for 2 years. So we're using this to argue that the mother and child should be reunited, right? So in this case, this appeal case, we're using Sharia to do what statutory law can't do. And we're hopeful that we're going to get a positive outcome in that case for the mother and daughter to be reunited, and that the mother's sentence will be postponed until her child is independent. So that's an example of how Sharia can really advance justice. We also use customary law a lot in our cases to keep children out of prisons and jails. So customary law in Somaliland is very male dominated. Only males can take part in negotiations in customary law, and women are sidelined. And it's because of this gender discrimination, it's often condemned as against human rights, right? That makes sense. If not everyone can equally participate, that goes against just very basic principles of equality. But this isn't the full picture, right? While admittedly we know that customary law creates more injustice than justice in some instances, right, on cases with women, it also presents a very real alternative option to arrest and prosecution of children. So for a large number of our cases where children are accused of petty behavior, right, petty offenses like stealing phones, or we get a lot of cases of teenagers who are fighting, right? Our first line of defense really is customary agreements, right? Is to turn to the traditional law in Somaliland and saying, is there an option here that we can use to alleviate the harm and keep a child from going to jail and keep a child from going to prison for years. The way this looks is we work with our clients' parents and the parents of the victim to basically negotiate a monetary compensation, right? And that's essentially what customary law is a monetary compensation for the harm done. And then we take this agreement and we go to the prosecution and convince them to drop the case, right? The harm is repaired and the child remains in their community. And you know, the thing is, when I first arrived in Somaliland, I would have seen this use of customary agreements as really against justice, right? As against reform, because it was happening outside of the formal law context. But my colleague Idris, if he's taught me anything, he's really taught me that that's not always the truth, right? That customary law at times can actually advance justice, right? That Sharia law can advance justice. And that if we're really going to advocate for human rights, if we're really going to make the lives of our clients better, then we need to fully understand that justice isn't only in human rights law. It isn't only, you know, in the Constitution or statutory laws. It's also in unlikely places like customary law and Sharia law. And finally, the third key lesson I want to share with you guys today is real change doesn't happen from a distance. And what I mean by this is, you know, we often think about human rights lawyering at the United Nations, right? Or we think of a lawyer like Amal Clooney, who is arguing a case maybe in front of the International Criminal Court or another international court, or maybe we imagine, you know, the heads of states negotiating human rights treaties. You know, maybe if we think of human rights work physically happening in countries like Somaliland, we might imagine a human rights researcher reporting on injustices, or, you know, maybe an international consultant flying in to the country for short-term capacity building training. And, you know, before I got here, that was really my own personal understanding of what a human rights lawyer might do, right? That's what we learn. That's what we hear about in the news, right? That's where these really big fancy proclamations of what a human right is come from. But what I've learned in Somaliland from my work, and again, this is a lesson for my colleagues and our clients, is that real change doesn't necessarily happen in these faraway venues, right? Real change often just happens in the trenches alongside the people whose rights are at stake. So in this photo, you can see myself, and again, my colleague Idris, and the other woman in the photo is our colleague Nimmo. And the teenage boy in the black shirt, he's one of our clients. His name is Hamza. And Hamza is 17 years old, and he lives in Hargeisa, which is the capital of Somaliland, and where Children's Legal Defense Center is based. And Hamza migrate irregularly to Europe, right? So he tried to get to Europe without a visa or proper legal documentation that allowed him to go to Europe. So Hamza was one of the boys that you see in the media reports about the Mediterranean, right? His plan was to travel from Somaliland to Ethiopia, to Sudan, to Libya, and then he was going to get on a boat and try to get to Europe. But as you can see from this photo, Hamza didn't succeed in his plan. Before he could even leave Somaliland, the Somaliland police arrested him. And, you know, he should have been immediately returned and reunited with his parents, trying to migrate, trying to, you know, go somewhere without a visa, without proper legal documentation, isn't a crime in Somaliland. It isn't an offense. So all the police really had the power to do was to stop him and reunite him with his parents. But instead, the police arrested Hamza, and the prosecutor charged him as a human smuggler, and he was facing 20 years in prison. So he was facing 20 years in prison for, being a 17-year-old boy and making a bad decision about, what he wanted to try to do with his life. So when, he was charged, we took his case. It was fairly easy to prove he wasn't a human smuggler, but instead a teenage boy. And he was ordered released by the judge. And, I'm really not highlighting this case to make us look like we're heroes at the Children's Legal Defense Center, but to demonstrate that getting close to the issues is often really necessary to make real change. So Hamza was arrested and prosecuted after an international development group was here training prosecutors and judges on how to prosecute human smuggling, right? This is often how internationals contribute to the development of Somaliland and other countries like here. They come in and do a training, and often the training is well-meaning, right? We all want human smuggling to stop. That is very well-meaning. But after this training, instead of prosecuting a human smuggler, the Somaliland government was prosecuting a 17-year-old boy. And so to me, this anecdote demonstrates that international actors, however well-meaning, when they decide what needs to happen from afar, right, like prosecuting human smugglers, things on the ground can often get muddled. We often try to do human rights work from a distance, right, from different places than what we're actually the context we're trying to affect. Whether you're in the UN headquarters in New York City, or you're preparing a training that you're going to give in country over a week, 5 days, right? Doing this work from a distance, if I've learned anything here, it doesn't necessarily result in justice. And if Hamza's case is indicative, it at times can be part of creating injustice, right? So, working with my colleagues, working with our clients, I've really just become persuaded that if we want to make real change, lasting change, then we need to get close to these issues, right? If we truly want to advance human rights, we can't be afraid to get into the country and really get close to the peoples whose lives are being impacted, right? Change doesn't happen from a distance. And it's really these three lessons, that prisons and jails won't get us to where we want to be. Justice isn't only found in human rights law and the courts, and real change doesn't happen from a distance. It's these three lessons that really motivated myself and my colleague Idris to establish a Children's Legal Defense Center during the pandemic. So we founded CLDC in November 2020, right in the thick of things, right in the thick of the pandemic. And we did this because, in Hargeisa, where we're based, approximately every month, 200 children, and by children, I mean 17 and younger, are arrested by the police. Often they're arrested without evidence. Often they're arrested even though they're below the age of 15, meaning they're too young for criminal punishment. And often they are convicted to years in prison for either, a simple discretion as a teenager, whether it's fighting or stealing a phone, or, often there's just no evidence to convict them, but there's no defense lawyer arguing their side. So it ends up that they go to prison for years, right? And so Idris and I, as lawyers, said this doesn't need to be happening, especially in Somaliland. There's a progressive legal framework that actually incorporates international human rights law, right? Like the best interests of the child, imprisonment as the last resort. So we have the ammunition, and we decided, okay, let us do something about it. And since November 2020, with a small team, it's myself, Idris, and 2 others, we've been able to assist 246 imprisoned children here in Somaliland. And of that 246, we've been able to win release for 141. And we've done this, numerous ways, whether it's through a customary agreement, right? Like an out-of-court agreement that's very helpful to releasing juveniles and getting them back home. Sometimes it's easy enough as helping the parents bring evidence of age to the court to prove that they're not 15, so they have to be ordered immediately released. Or sometimes it's just enough to get in court, have a lawyer speaking on behalf of the child to say, there's no evidence in this case, so it has to be dismissed. We've also focused on reducing prison sentences. So sometimes kids do go to prison, right? We can't win all of our cases, although we'd like everyone to be released. Sometimes they do go to prison, but they have a right under the law that their sentences should be reduced compared to an adult sentence. So we've been able to secure reduced sentences for 35 other children. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, how are 4 people doing all of this? And the truth is, we don't do it alone, right? We have an approach where we also work with family members. So we've worked with approximately 738 family members. That sounds like a high number, but in Somaliland, families are big and families are very, very involved. Including in criminal cases if their family member is arrested. So it's not uncommon that we're working with a mother and a father and a sister and a brother and an aunt and an uncle, all on one case and all for one child. And we've harnessed this. We've started teaching the family members the law, how it applies to their children's cases, and then working with them to use it. And so the family members have started helping us collect evidence. They can make complaints at court. And when they really have an understanding of the rights that their children have, how the criminal justice system works, we have found that it's really powerful and they can challenge injustice. So it's really together with the family members of our clients that we've been able to achieve some really positive outcomes for our clients. And we're also working, right? So, we're helping kids case by case, but we're also trying to affect system change through our cases. One of the really common complaints in Somaliland is judges, prosecutors, police, they don't know the law, we need to train them. So we're trying to use our cases as educational tools, whether to teach the law or to teach mindsets, right? It's not uncommon for a judge to ask us why we are representing a woman who is charged with trading alcohol, right? Alcohol is against Islam. Why would you defend this woman? And our answer is always, under the Constitution, everyone has a right to defense, no matter what they're accused of, right? So we're really trying to work systematically with our cases to really, create some lasting change within the system. But really the number one thing, and this ties back to the beginning of why I went to Oxford, really the number one thing we've been able to achieve since November 2020 is reuniting children with their families. So this boy, you might recognize him from the beginning of my talk. This is Abdul Hakim again, with his mother. And we were able to help reunite him with his mother after we took his case. We helped his parents collect evidence that Abdul Hakim was only 13 at the time. He was accused of stealing a mobile phone. We helped them present this evidence to the judge on the case, and the judge ordered his release. And within 2 weeks that we started working on his case, Abdul Hakim was at home with his mom. He was at home with his dad. And to me, I think, that's really what Oxford is about. It's about, using our knowledge, using what we learn at such a great university like Oxford to affect positive change in the world. And, I may not feel like I became a human rights lawyer in the halls of Oxford, but undoubtedly what I learned at Oxford has enabled me to do what I'm doing now, right? It has enabled me to work with my colleagues to really challenge the injustice of imprisoning children for long amounts of time, or wrongfully imprisoning them when there's no evidence against them. So I'll end my comments there. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. The last slide is just to say, if you want to keep following our journey, we are on the internet, and we would love for you to check us out. Rebecca, I haven't left many minutes for questions, but I'll turn it back over to you.
That's really kind. Caitlin, thank you so much. I found that absolutely fascinating. What an amazing achievement as well in such a relatively short time. So what I'm going to say is, audience members, if you have a question for Caitlin, please feel free to raise an electronic hand, or we have the chat function, so please feel free to put something in the chat. I know Caitlin would love to answer questions. Linda Grant, you have raised an electronic hand. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Linda. Hi, where are you calling from?
UK.
Lovely. Okay, what's your question for Caitlin?
Yes, I'm going to summarize it. So first of all, I just want to thank Caitlin for the brilliant presentation and for the kind of organization she found and she's running. So few things. What was her motivation for why I chose Somaliland? That is one. And then secondly, the mixing of the laws works well when it's in the positive. But what if it's in the negative? And I just hope there are no consequences from also legal perspective when mixing of those laws can occur. And then who sits and reviews the laws, especially the Sharia and the Customary? And also when you're dealing with the issues of those children, how is their integration like, so that they don't fall into those petty crimes again? It's pretty loaded. Thank you. All right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. Caitlin. Oh, Caitlin, you're on mute.
Great.
There you are.
Hopefully you can hear me, Linda. Oh, am I still muted? I think I'm unmuted.
You're okay now. You're okay. We can hear you.
Wonderful. Linda, thank you so much for your questions. I'll try to answer them all very quickly before we run out of time. I ended up in Somaliland through a personal connection. Someone I had worked with previously in Rwanda invited me to work here for 6 months in 2015, and I just kind of got stuck. It's a really interesting environment where you can really impact a lot of change. My colleagues are really, inspiring lawyers, trying to advance justice in their context. So really, kind of the issues in the children in prison is what made me stay. But I got here through a personal connection. Yeah, that's a really good question about, okay, so customary law, Sharia law, they can have good things and they can have bad things. What do you do with the bad things? So basically, like any good lawyer, we highlight the laws that we feel are towards justice, and we don't use customary law or Sharia law when it is against human rights. So a perfect example of that is a rape case. Often in customary law, if there is a rape, they will solve it through a customary agreement, meaning the defendant's family will pay the victim's family. Sometimes the victim will have to marry her rapist. And so if we have a case of where a child is accused of committing rape, do not use the customary system. So that is an example of when we'll pick that type of crime, that very serious crime, that has to go through the courts. And that kind of answers your last question about, okay, what about the children who are committing serious crimes, right? Like, unfortunately, that happens. Children, a teenage boy might commit a rape, a child might be involved in a murder. And so for those serious cases is when we take them through the courts. And so even if there's evidence against them and they're found guilty, our strategy is to still say, okay, even though it is a serious offense under the law, they have a right to a reduced sentence, because at the end of the day, they're a child. So even if they do have to go to prison for the crime, if there's evidence against them, then we argue for reducing their prison sentence. So say maybe an adult, for an adult charged with rape, maybe they get 10 years. We would advocate that the child only get 5 years or something like that, right? We try to protect them by reducing the time that they spend in prisons. And I think you asked a question about who reviews all of the laws in Somaliland. I think maybe that's a question about law reform. So law reform is really complicated in Somaliland since there's multiple forms of law. But the way that it works is when you reform a law, it's the Somaliland Parliament. They try to include both customary law, statutory law, and Sharia law all in one. It makes for a very, very complex legal framework that isn't always easy to understand and easy to interpret. But that's what we're trying to do at CLDC, is take this legal framework and use it to advance justice for children. Thanks, Linda. Hopefully I answered your question.
Thank you, Caitlin. And I can see that Ronald has put a question in the chat box. And I think actually you may have partially answered this in your response to Linda's question, because what Ronald's, yes. So Ronald's question was basically, have there been cases where the requirements of customary or Sharia are inconsistent with other elements of a progressive legal system? And Ronald's now saying, I think you answered my question. I'm curious about how prosecutors and lawyers in Somaliland are trained. Now that is an interesting question. Do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, I do know the answer to that. And thanks, Ronald, for your questions. I think it's, a really interesting point that both you and Lydia made about, okay, sometimes what we think is good is also inconsistent. So I just want to make one more point on the use of custom and Sharia and statutory law. I think it's, what we've learned here is just trying to keep an open mind and using all venues to advance justice, all forms of law to advance justice, and that there's not one single story that's true about a legal system or true about a law. So I do know how prosecutors and lawyers and judges are trained in Somaliland. And that's a really good question, right? Because Somaliland is a post-conflict society. In the Civil War in the late 80s and the 90s, the reason why Somaliland declared independence from Somalia is because the then military dictatorship, Siad Barre, he attacked Somaliland. And his policy was to kill everyone but the Crows. So there was just a terrible campaign of bombing. That Somaliland was just leveled. People were killed. Everything was ruined, right? The institutions that were here, educational institutions, were flattened. So it's very much a post-conflict society. And in post-conflict societies, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the education system is not as strong, right? Somaliland doesn't have an Oxford yet, right? It's just since the 90s rebuilding its institutions, including its universities. So if you're a Somaliland lawyer, there are law schools here. One in particular, Hargeisa University, you can get an LLB degree. And most prosecutors and lawyers and judges now who are under the age of 40 roughly, they have an LLB degree. But I mention the post-conflict environment because the law school is not as robust as it needs to be. So when people graduate from school, they don't necessarily have a very strong command of the law or how to make legal arguments at no fault of their own. It's just part of the context here and part of healing after such a brutal civil war. So that is often where this training, this lack of training, is often where international actors step in, like the example in Hemsa's case, where there was an international development group training on prosecuting smugglers. And the training is needed. Part of the problem is it's designed from very far away. So one of my personal motivations in setting up CLDC is being able to act as a mentor for my colleagues. Right now we're a small team. It's myself, Idris, and 2 others, but Idris and our 2 other colleagues, they're Somaliland lawyers. And we've been working together, for several years now, even before we set up CLDC. And so one of the things that we really focus on at work is legal education, right? Every Sunday we do what we call legal review. We break down the laws. We try to build stronger arguments. And so in this way, in a context where prosecutors and lawyers and judges may not have the strongest training, that's again what we're trying to do with our casework, is bringing a good example of a really strong legal argument, so that hopefully that can also contribute to advancing Somaliland's laws. Okay, let me just jump right in and answer the second. Ronald, you have really good questions. Best imams and other experts in Islam play a role as experts. And where this comes up in Somaliland law is basically monetary compensation, right? A lot of the crimes that happen in Somaliland are injury crimes, right? You might assault someone and maybe you cut their face, or you injure their hand. And so it's at that point where the imams and other experts in Islamic law come in and they say, under the Sharia, your injury is worth X amount of money. So a lot of times we don't, in Somaliland, Sharia isn't necessarily used how we hear about it in the media of, okay, there's these severe punishments, da 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 da. But often what is happening in criminal cases is if there is, a civil compensation that has to be calculated. That's where the imams come in. Also, many of the judges have Sharia backgrounds, and those are the judges that decide family law, right? Islam and the Sharia is really strong in a family law context. So if you want to get a divorce here or child custody, that is often also where you see imams or other Islamic law experts playing a role. I hope I answered your question, Ronald. Oh, you're so nice.
Thank you, Ronald. Thank you very much for your questions. So it's 5-1. May I just ask a question, Caitlin, before we wrap up, if that's all right? I just wonder what's next. What's next for CLDC? Where are you going to go from here? Because obviously you've reeled off some really impressive sort of figures about the numbers, the sheer numbers of children that you've helped. But what are your kind of goals for the next kind of 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I think one of our main goals, and it might seem like a humble goal, is operationally to just keep doing what we're doing. There are not a lot of lawyers in Somaliland. In Hargeisa, the city where we're working, which is the capital, mind you, so the largest population, there are roughly about estimated around 40 defense lawyers, private defense lawyers, and there's really no public defender to speak of. Legal aid only happens when, you know, there's funding from maybe the UK government or the US government, right? So really one of our main goals for the next 6 months, the next 12 months, the next 5 years, the next 10 years is just really to be able to maintain what we're doing and be a constant presence here that can provide this legal assistance and criminal defense to children who are imprisoned. So, you know, that's kind of maybe a little bit more modest than you were hoping for, Rebecca. I think,
not at all.
Yeah, we just want to, you know, be able to keep doing what we're doing. And, you know, we have a few cases that, you know, that we want to use our cases for. There's no disclosure to the defense of evidence, right? In the UK, if there's a prosecution, the prosecutor has to disclose.
Yes, absolutely.
It doesn't happen here, even though it's permitted under the law. So we're set to challenge that. Bail is not commonly used, so we're coming up with a legal argument to challenge the lack of bail. And another really big problem we face is the police in Somaliland are still militarized, right? They were militarized under the military dictatorship, and that's never changed. So they often, you know, arrest and then beat people, or they force confessions. So case-wise, we're also looking to bring a few challenges on police brutality and forced confessions. I feel like I'm talking about the United States, but
well,
I think often challenges in criminal justice are the same throughout the world. So that's kind of what's on our docket in the future.
No, well, I mean, it's amazing. And just going back to your point, I think before the audience joined us, we were just saying, you know, context is everything. And actually to say that carrying on is one of your primary goals, I think, well, I don't think that's ever a humble goal, but actually, especially within the context within which you are working, that I think is actually a really hard thing to do. I feel, I'm sure like other audience members, completely humbled by listening to this, to your talk, Caitlin, and I'm absolutely full of admiration for what you're doing over there. I think we've got 1 minute to go, so I think pending any sort of question from the floor, I'd like to thank you, Caitlin, for a really, well, I'll use Ronald's term, if I may, a really inspiring presentation. And thanks to the audience for spending an hour with us this afternoon and tuning in. So thank you very much. Caitlin, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks for everyone tuning in. It's been a pleasure.